a belated Happy Independence Day to all Ukrainians, because yesterday marked 1 years of Ukrainian independence in the modern era. Of course, Ukraine was independent some centuries prior to that, because remember there was that August 1991 coup. I remember as a child when Mikhail Gorbachev was overthrown, 3 days of protests. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Federation, famously stood on that tank outside the White House in Moscow, and the coups were defeated. And then the other Soviet republics rapidly declared independence, Ukraine amongst them. So Ukraine was marking that day, which happens to be exactly 6 months since the war began. And so President Zelensky, he addressed the nation and he said that he should take back all the national territory, all 25 regions, and he will not make any concessions whatsoever. Now, that's tough talk, but as I might explain later, I think that's decidedly unrealistic. So President Zelensky, he alluded to the Russian army as terrorists. Now, that's not correct because obviously they are a legitimately constituted army. They're carrying out an illegal war as judged by the International Court of Justice. The first war in history that the International Court of Justice has ruled to be illegal whilst it's going on. I mean, illegal for Russia, which is the aggressor, not illegal for those who are defending themselves, the Ukrainians. So burnt out Russian tanks were displayed in Kiev to bolster the morale of the Ukrainian people. And NATO countries now estimate that Russia suffers something like 80,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, missing, deserted. Ukraine's casualties are probably rather lower than that, partly because their population's lower. But I'd not think not ridiculously low, maybe like 40,000. Bear in mind that Russia's got 3.5 times the population of Russia, of Ukraine. But for Ukraine, this is a war of survival. For Russia, this is a war of choice. So this discretionary war could be ended by them any time. So the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he went on a surprise visit to Kiev. He didn't say so in advance for security reasons, or was it perhaps because he just went on a whim, as he tends to do? He's a very whimsical person. Anyway, he was awarded the Medal of Freedom by the Ukrainians because he's been absolutely stalwart in backing the Ukrainians. This is partly the United Kingdom expiating its sins of having welcomed suspicious Russian money in the early 90s, really rolled out the red carpet and not taken firm action against the Ruskies over the murder of Litvinenko and things like that. The attempted murder of Sergei Skripal, which murdered an unrelated woman who happened to touch the poison later, and so on. So Prime Minister Johnson, he's due to step down on the 5th of September. This is his last hurrah, really. And he announced the United Kingdom is granting another 64 million US dollars worth of military aid. That's 54 million pounds worth. There's going to be over 2,000 drones, which he claims are the cutting edge of technology, anti-tank munitions, as well as other hardware. So on that same day, the United States announced an additional $3 billion in military aid. So there were no large-scale gatherings in Kiev or other Ukrainian cities on Independence Day for fear that the Russians would attack and kill many civilians. Because remember that Daria Dugina, that Russian woman who was killed by a car bomb in Moscow a few days ago, that Russia's blamed on Ukraine. Ukraine has disavowed responsibility, but the Russians may wish to seek vengeance. So Daria Dugina, she had advocated for this war of aggression. Her father was well known as being really Putin's pet philosopher. It doesn't seem like much like a philosopher than me, is really just a hyper-nationalist, chauvinist who believes in this ultra-aggressive policy that Russia should subjugate and oppress all her neighbors again. This is somehow desirable when all that do is perpetuate oppression in Russia. So anyway, but the Russians, they did bomb a railway station and kill 22 people and wound about 50 on that day. But was this a legitimate target? I mean, I suppose you do bomb enemy infrastructure, means of transport, and the Ukrainians are doing to the Russians. All right, fair enough. You should do it if you can to avoid killing civilians. You blow it up in the middle of the night, or blow up the actual trains in the depot, not place where civilians are going to be. Blow up the track, and not right before a civilian train is coming, so the civilian train doesn't go off it. Anyway, the European Union yesterday repeated that it shall back Ukraine for as long as it takes. But this rings hollow because although the European Union itself is giving the Ukrainians money, and Ukraine needs at least 6 billion euros a month just to sustain itself in terms of salaries and vital equipment. EU member states, individual member states, are severally donating less and less than before. They're getting tired. The cupboard is bare. They've given away quite a few weapons and quite a lot of munitions, and they need it for themselves. And of course, they can buy more, but that costs more. Some of the countries like Poland, Slovakia, Romania said Soviet-era weapons, hand them over to the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians already know how to use those, don't have to be trained on them. And obviously, US is backfilling with more modern equipment for these Eastern European countries, but it takes time to manufacture them. And they've actually been quite niggardly. Some, these Western NATO countries. The US are now 400 HIMARS, has donated about 12. And the Ukrainians said we need 300 to win this war. Then said we merely need 100. And the US could easily provide 100. They could manufacture another 100 for themselves. That might take a few months, but they can do it. Anyway, perhaps curiously, Belarus jubilated Ukraine on its Independence Day, and President Lukashenko wished for cordiality. Now, you may say that takes some chutzpah when obviously he allowed his country to be used as a jumping off point for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And up until this time, relations between Zelensky and Lukashenko were warm. On a personal level, they got along well, despite the gulf between them ideologically. Because Zelensky's a Western-oriented liberal person, was a comic actor. Was Lukashenko was manager of a state farm. He is the last Stalinist. He tries to be more Russian than the Russians. Wanted to keep the Soviet era going and all the rest of it. Very much an authoritarian, violently intolerant of the least dissent. Has jailed well over 10,000 people for peaceful protest. That's about 0.1% of his population. Think about it. 1,000 people are political prisoners in Belarus. There are other people in prison in Belarus for ordinary things like theft. But that's staggering. But nevertheless, the chemistry between them was good until recently. But when Lukashenko became over a barrel for losing that election, which he cheated in massively using large-scale violence to stay in office, then he was helpless. He was completely reliant on the Kremlin. So Moscow said, well, then you have to let us use your land to invade Ukraine. And they did, which made things a lot easier for Russia because they could attack from 3 directions, not just 2. They could attack from the north as well as from the east and the south. But perhaps Belarus is hinting that it might wish to act as the honest broker, be an intermediary in peace talks. Now you might say, oh, come on, you can't play the honest broker when you were blatantly favoring one side, when you expedited this Russian expedition, to say the very least, when you voted for them in the United Nations, one of only 5 countries to vote on Russia's side, and that includes Russia. So it's happy this Independence Day is still there. Obviously, Russia would like there to be no Independence Day. There's really no end to this war in sight. I was listening to what Lord Dannatt was saying, the former head of the British Army, saying that yes, all this rhetoric is very inspiring of Zelensky, but it's also completely unrealistic. Much as though Lord Dannatt would like to see Ukraine triumphant, regain its liberty throughout all its regions, is really unlikely. The Russians are moving forward at a snail's pace, but Ukraine just doesn't have the military might to push them out completely, especially in places where they're deeply entrenched, like Crimea, like the eastern part of Donetsk and Luhansk districts. So this war is grinding on, might start winding down. Putin might try and have a ceasefire or unilaterally declare one. But if Ukraine rejects that, he might up the ante. Would he turn to nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, something like that? And Western countries may not be willing to carry on paying the bills and providing the armaments forever. The trouble is, if there is some sort of peace, even a de facto acceptance of the Russian occupation of some regions of Ukraine, that's not going to be permanent because Putin's done this before in 2014. He grabbed what he could, then he stopped, but the pushback wasn't too hard, and he consolidated. He waited till he thought was the propitious moment, partly after coronavirus and so on, partly because he had Belarus who was having to cooperate, and other things is because Western countries, he was gradually reducing oil and gas supplies, making the prices sky high, and then he moved when he thought he had a golden opportunity. Didn't quite work out for him, but what he could do is take a breathing space of a few years to regroup, to build up armaments, and then attack again, and wait till the political situation is possibly more favorable in Ukraine. He has a president who's less popular, who's a bit of a dimwit. He might, if he has Trump back in the White House, if the situation evolves in other European countries such that they are enfeebled, their will is weakened for whatever reason, there is an economic crisis, and then he might see this as a golden opportunity to try and swallow the rest of Ukraine. So some people say that's why you mustn't give him an inch. People were too soft to him in 2014. Had we stood firm in 2014, we wouldn't have been here. But we were just addicted to cheap oil and gas. Right, thank you for watching. Please subscribe to me on Patreon. Yeah, and book online lessons with me, tours in London when you come to Londinium. And yeah, so follow me on social media. Thank you so much for your donations on PayPal, georgecallahan79 at gmail.com. I desperately need those to keep going. And so check out my website, George from Ireland. Toodaloo.